This is the
Five Stars
podcast.
Let me talk to you.
Hi.
So, what do you guys want to talk about? Tell me we're not telling lies.
Thanks, guys. Back to you.
What's going on, everybody? It's another extremely humid week here in Cleveland. Or should I say the outskirts of Cleveland, which is where I'm situated at. It's not as bad as it's been the past couple weeks. I actually walked around a bit on Sunday morning and it was quite cool. I think the high was something like 81, 82. That might seem hot, but compared to a lot of the weather we've been getting lately, it is considerably cooler. I've been trying to monitor my sun time. I'm always tempted to just want to get up on Sunday morning and go sit outside for like 30 minutes to an hour with a cup of coffee, especially when it's super nice out. But then I have to remember, it's not a great idea to lounge in the sun for extended periods of time. Skin cancer is a real thing. I'm just enjoying it while I can, because it's only going to get progressively colder as the months go by. And I was absolutely miserable this past winter season. I was so fed up with snow by the end of March. You have no idea, people. I'll take these excruciating hot summer days any day over cold and snow. Sometimes I feel like Dave Brown on Memphis TV doing the weather reports in the middle of the wrestling shows. I turn on the audio to start recording. It's a wrestling podcast. And I'm always trying to immediately break the ice by talking about the weather. No wonder I'm such a boring, bland personality. This is why I don't have a relationship. My natural tendency is to immediately bring up conversation about weather. And Lord knows chicks give a crap about that stuff. A wise man once said, "You can do many things with a woman, but you can't bore her." I still have not figured that out yet. But hey, my life's fine. What do you say we break away from the weather talk and get into the wrestling talk before I devolve into conversations about intersexual dynamics? Welcome to the Five Starr Wrestling Report. You know the motto by now. The wrestling podcast nobody knows but everybody needs. Make sure you subscribe, comment, and leave a like down below for me. Appreciate everybody who checks out the channel every week on YouTube and Rumble. It is the Friday show. So we've got the TBS Superstation program and Midsouth television to cover today. I say that as if there wasn't an entire month that went by where we did not talk about a single Saturday night episode. It was a combination of the Clash and pay-per-view recaps, plus, me not being around to do a couple Friday shows. So now that it's been 2 weeks in a row where the Friday shows have been normal, it's kind of weird. All of a sudden, I'm expecting the Fall Brawl Clash to be right around the corner, even though we still got like a month and a half. But let's get into this thing. Show's back to 2 hours this week. Every time I mention that, I can sense the soul being sucked out of me. I actually get excited when the shows are only an hour, because at least I can say the pain won't be as detrimental. But you know, even though it was 2 hours, it was not quite as detrimental as I thought it would be. Now, a couple things I want to mention here before we talk about the opening tag of Flying Brian and the Z-Man taking on State Patrol. Yes, they have put Pillman and Zank back together as a tag team. A move that I was not too keen on. I can honestly say without shame, I have no memory of ever seeing Pillman and Zank team together after they dropped the US tag titles to the Midnight Express. But they did an inset promo where they explained that they're getting back together and looking to climb the ranks of the tag division. They're going to do it with a smile. And it was so lame and so embarrassingly cringe. I actually wrote here, these two are better off getting squashed by Vader and Mean Mark on pay-per-view. Also, Trucker Norman was out there for absolutely no reason. I think we briefly touched on the whole Norman thing last week, but I'll circle back to that conversation in a bit because they actually had an in-depth look at how the former loony bin patient became a certified truck driver. And I will go ahead and let you know now, because I know the anticipation is killing you. It was not a very well thought out gimmick change. To say that Pillman and Zank's double team offense here was rusty, that would be a mild understatement. There were some clunky spots early on here where they absolutely were not on the same page together, including a spot where Pillman took one of the State Patrol in a go-behind, and he began running with him toward the ropes. At the same time, he also wound up running directly into Zank and almost taking him out. I mostly blame Zank for blowing that spot. That was totally on him. He was just standing there in the line of fire like a moron. I watched the spot back and I'm like, what did you think was going to happen, dude? Get out of the way. But they eventually slowed it down and State Patrol took over on Pillman for a little bit. Cole set up for the hot tag spot where Pillman hit the double slingshot clothesline on the heels. Then he tagged in the Z-Man so he could run wild with a couple flurry spots. He also at one point nearly took out Randy Anderson with a clothesline. Actually, come to think of it, the Z-Man sucked in this match. He was all over the place here. Thankfully, it didn't go much longer after he got tagged in. Zank and Pillman hit the double-assisted slingshot splash on Buddy Parker and got the pinfall. For what it's worth, the crowd liked the finish. So whatever momentum this Pillman-Zank team still had, after they didn't do jack shit with them through the entirety of the summer, they are still to a lesser degree over with the fans. God bless them. The question is, how did they capitalize on that momentum? Well, that is another story entirely. But on the topic of news stories and new developments, we have an update on Norman. How he inconspicuously went from a dangerous criminal from the insane asylum to now he is a normal truck driver. It seems preposterous. One might say downright impractical. Well, here's how they explain the deal. They had Captain Mike Rotunda talk about how Norman had been off television for the last couple months. For the record, I barely noticed. But Mike had talked with Norman in the last day or two, and he heard that Norman's dad had passed away. And Norman's dad happened to be a truck driver. And since Norman had a connection with his father, he meant a lot to his life, he decided that he wanted to honor his legacy by becoming a truck driver of his own, while at the same time also pursuing his career as a pro wrestler. Well, in all honesty, the story isn't that impractical. Hell, Ron and Jimmy Garvin became certified pilots while they moonlit as pro wrestlers. I don't really see what makes Norman that much different. It is funny because, a lot of people like to shit on the Trucker Norman gimmick. For my money, I still think Bastion Booger was way more degrading and more harmful for his career. That and that brief run he had as the fake monk in the WWF. Whatever his name was. Friar Ferguson. Those gimmicks were ass. At least they attempted to give Norman some kind of hook so that it wasn't just him waking up one day and deciding, yeah, you know what? I don't want to be a babyface from the insane asylum anymore. I just want to be a normal human being that also happens to drive trucks. Now, in all fairness, did any of these gimmicks help to establish or get over Mike Shaw in a major wrestling organization? Absolutely not. He was doomed to failure the minute they debuted him as Norman the Lunatic last year. They could have repackaged him a million times and he was never going to get over. But I will say, Trucker Norman was the least egregious of all the bad gimmicks. So I guess you can classify it as one of those don't throw the baby out with the bathwater type arguments. I have no reason to doubt that Mike's dad was a legit truck driver, or that he had a huge impact on his life and wanted to carry on his father's legacy on TV. It's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But I think we can also be realistic and understand that there was only so much leverage a truck driving gimmick had in pro wrestling. If you need further proof of that, see the bulk of the bad gimmick ideas Vince McMahon used in the WWF in the mid to late 90s. Remember when Bob Holly was a race car driver? Where did that get him? Except being the brunt of the jokes when the fans laughed at him. So they talked about that for a few minutes. They also aired the replay of last week's main event with Stan Hansen and Tommy Rich, mostly highlighting the fallout when Stan got himself DQ'd and then started attacking Pee Wee Anderson with a cowbell, which consequently led to him getting suspended in storyline. I don't think I put over enough how great Stan was in selling after he got told he was being fined and suspended. With him yelling into the camera, "Nobody suspends me!" And he's smashing his cowbell against the concrete as the cameras are cutting away to the end credits. It was very campy, but it was great. Frankly, I got so caught up in putting over Nick Patrick, I forgot about Stan Hansen. He also had a great performance there. Then we came back for a Sting promo. And I don't really want to belabor a lot of what we already talked about at the Bash pay-per-view a couple weeks back. I think if anything, this particular promo encapsulated all that was wrong with Sting's first world title reign. Maybe I'm alone in this theory. To me, there's something very off-putting about him coming out and basically saying, There's nothing really unique or different about me, even though I'm the current World Heavyweight Champion. I'm still the same guy. I get what he was trying to say. Like, he wants to assure to the people that he's still the same dude. He's not going to let his ego run out of control now that he's the top guy in the company. But the whole time he's talking, he sounds like he's deliberately selling himself short. And it's not really something you like hearing as a fan, especially from your top baby faces. The ones that don't come across as confident, the ones that are too humble and meek. You know, you start to question their legitimacy at that point. It wasn't a bad promo. It just had a lot of bad undertones. And even though the people cheer for him here, I mean, you often hear fans talk about the difference in pops with Sting from, say, the spring of 1990 versus the summer or fall of 1990. How he was much more over in the spring compared to when he came back from the ACL injury and finally won the world title over the summer. It's not that far-fetched. I would definitely concur that Sting was much more popular in the earlier part of the year than he is now. Just listening to the fan reception for him. I mean, it's only been a couple weeks, but there is a difference. I still think they made the right call in putting the belt on him. But there is something to be said about the lack of momentum that the Stinger had after the fact. And it kind of reflects in his promos. He just doesn't seem enthused or super crazy about being the top guy. It should be a much bigger deal than it is, but they're just not presenting it that way. Almost like it's a complete afterthought. And then you got the Horseman, which is a whole other matter of its own. First off, I don't want to get ahead of myself here. This promo they cut here was phenomenally great. If anything, because of Arn and Sid's delivery. The material was pretty straightforward. They're all business now that Sting has the title. The Horsemen used to be about fun and games, but now they have one mission. And that mission is to bring the world title back to the family. And what I loved about all this, you had three guys in this pre-tape. Barry Windham, Arn Anderson, and Sid Vicious. Barry cuts his promo first. Super solemn and serious. Arn cuts his promo. Super solemn and serious. Very hush-toned. Very deliberate and to the point. Almost as if they were just human beings talking to the camera. And then it's Sid's turn to talk. And if you've ever heard a Psycho Sid promo, you know what you're getting. This guy had one speaking volume, and it was loud and in your face. And so Sid goes on this huge tirade about how he's going to take the World Heavyweight title from him and bring it back to the Horsemen. He's spitting at the camera, peeking the microphone. Barry at one point just straight up breaks kayfabe and starts laughing because the whole thing is so goddamn hilarious. And then right at the very end, after Sid finishes his loud rant, Arn Anderson, without blinking, back to the hushed tone, just goes, "The symbol of excellence." And they all throw up the $4 sign. I unfortunately did not record an audio snippet of this. I'm kind of half tempted to just play the whole thing so you can hear it. It was absolutely brilliant. I died laughing at this. I actually might have to do it now. I'm going to have to go back and record the audio sample. It is worth hearing.
Something has happened within the organization. Something has gone wrong. And now, we don't have a thing to lose. Because now when we step into any ring, when we come to any building in any city in this country, we're hungry. Sting and Luger seem to think that they're sitting on top of the world right now. But when I go home and look in the mirror, I think about the things that I've had and the things that I'm gonna have. These two guys right here, along with Flair, have got nothing to lose, just like me. And everybody out there is gonna find out just how vengeful a bunch of guys that don't care about anything can be.
We protected that title with our heart and soul. We got nothing on earth to lose. We did a lot of rope-a-doping in the past, a lot of shucking and jiving, a lot of playing with the women. All dead news, nothing but business. You gotta get out of each car in each town, every gym you go in, every restaurant you go in, you look over your shoulder. We're not above jumping on you and TCBY yogurt. It may sound funny to you, but it's dead serious. I'm looking at a bunch of dead men as we speak. Big Sid?
Sting! No matter what I gotta do, if it's to break every bone in your body, I will get that title back in the family of the Four Horsemen, no matter what it takes.
Still the symbol of excellence. Bottom line.
But again, though, I come back to the whole discussion about where we are with the Horsemen in 1990. It's another week where Ric Flair's absent from being around the rest of the Horsemen. They're on TV talking shit and doing promos, but they don't have their core main guy around. It's so weird. It's like the First Family doing a promo on Memphis TV without Jimmy Hart present. You need your main mouthpiece. You need your ringleader present. And it's not to take anything away from Wyndham Anderson and Sid, but out of these three guys, who would you even consider second in command? I guess it had to be Arn by default, but the gap there is pretty substantial. They didn't even have Ole be a part of this. And Ole was typically the mouthpiece that would fill in when Flair wasn't around. But even so, there's no explanation for why Rick isn't there. They didn't even provide a storyline explanation here. They just skipped right over it. And it's not just the Horseman promos. Rick's barely been on TV, period, over the last several months. This week was actually a rarity where we saw Rick in the ring working a match. Now, I know why that was the case. It was Jim Herd wanting to continually reduce his on-screen appearances. I think Rick was also dealing with some kind of staph infection around this time. But even omitting the staph infection, look at how he's been presented. It's been painfully obvious over the last year how badly Herd wanted Flair out of the picture. Now we're finally seeing how it affects the product. Go figure. It has not been a great result. So that brought us to Sid Vicious versus Tim Hughes. As I'm watching this match, I'm also noting that the fans were not clamoring behind Sid like we were accustomed to. It's funny how at the pay-per-view, the fans in Baltimore couldn't wait to see Sid get in the ring to beat people up. Here he was just your standard run-of-the-mill bad guy. The fans actually booed him. Sid was very much a heel this week. There was absolutely nothing to the match. Sid pounded on Hughes forever and then ended up winning with a jackknife powerbomb. But it was weird how non-split the crowd was for Sid. everybody was pretty much unanimously booing him here. Maybe those threats of taking the world title away from the Stinger actually got to him. We found the one chink in the armor, the one motive in WCW that'll cause fans to hate Psycho Sid, threatening to beat up Sting. That's the only case. Elsewise, fans still cheer him for being too much of a badass. God, it's hard to imagine they actually spent like 3 months building up this Sting-Sid title match for Halloween Havoc. I remember next to nothing about the build either. So it must have either been very unmemorable or flat out boring. And or they didn't promote it at all. I guess we'll find out. Here's something that's also unmemorable and flat out boring. Tommy Rich working with the Shadow for 5 minutes on TV. Here's the dilemma I ran into though. As far as I know, I don't think I fell asleep watching this match. At the same time, I don't recall a fucking thing about it. And I did not write anything down aside from Tommy wins with a sunset roll-up. So I must have spaced out for about 4 minutes and 55 seconds and then came to right as Tommy hit his finish and won. It's Tommy Rich versus The Shadow on WCW TV. I also didn't get much out of this Junkyard Dog pre-tape. I believe he hinted at the idea that people are underestimating his willpower, and he's still on the hunt for the Horseman. And you see, the thing about it is, after the people had seen what the Dog was physically capable of doing in that Ric Flair match the other month, is it any wonder people were questioning his willpower? I'm pretty confident that match exposed everything we needed to know about JYD in 1990. And the Dog having willpower and or determination. Heck of a time to be cutting that promo. After what we saw at the June Clash. You certainly didn't have the determination to hit the gym to try to hide those man titties. Tell you that much. God love him. We had Doom versus Dave Johnson and Tony Barton and or Bob Mercedes. Depending on who you ask. The graphic read Tony Barton. JR referred to him as Bobby Mercedes. I think he fucked up his format somehow. But then again, I don't think there was a jobber on this week's show named Bobby Mercedes either. So I have no idea where he read that name off. I was totally convinced that Dave Johnson wasn't Tony Zane with long hair. Facially, they looked exactly alike. They were also very plump, fat, out-of-shape dudes with zero athletic ability whatsoever. Which is why these are always my favorite kinds of squash matches to watch. It's one thing when the stars are out there beating up on average job guys. It's another thing when they're in there beating up clueless hacks that don't know their ass from a hole in the ground. The team of Dave Johnson and Tony Barton, they fit the bill of clueless hacks that had no idea what they were doing. It brought me back to those classic studio squashes from Crockett TV in 1986 or 87, when every squash was a delight. Just one goofball local job guy after another getting pounded into oblivion. The matches were utterly horrible most weeks. But there'd always be that one occasional spot or bump that I could laugh at. To be honest, there wasn't anything super hysterically bad about this. Aside from Johnson and Barton's rope running, which was god-awful. They did do some comical selling for Ron and Butch's punches. But Doom had their fun here. Spent several minutes wearing the guys down before putting them away with the Doomsday. Simmons did push-ups on the one guy's chest during the pinfall. That's the funny part, too. It's not just a matter of them working the guys over. Ron and Butch knew that these guys had zero cardio, and they knew they had a few minutes to work with. They were just going to wear these fucking guys out. They knew they couldn't keep up, but they were just going to keep applying the pressure. Let me assure you, Johnson and Barton were very much winded by the end of this match. That was also hysterical. I seem to recall, too, unless they didn't start doing this until way later in the fall, I know Doom eventually gets into a feud with the Horsemen over the tag belts. Specifically Arn and Barry. That was the big Starrcade program in December. It was Doom versus Arn and Barry. It's one of the last things I remember them doing before they just sort of fizzled out as a team the following year. But I also recall it being a sort of weird quasi-heel versus heel type feud where Doom kind of turned babyface, but not really. Offhand, I don't remember the whole dynamic of how they did it, but I know they were toying with the idea of wanting to prep Ron Simmons to eventually branch out as a singles babyface. But I always thought it was interesting how they never bothered to directly turn both Ron and Butch face. Especially for a Horseman program. They kept Butch heel for pretty much the remainder of his run. Then we had the Rock and Roll Express taking on Joe Kazana and Snake Watson. Not to be confused with Snake Brown. I actually got excited there for a minute. I was like, hell yeah, he's back. Then I realized, oh wait, no, that's the wrong Snake. So they wrestled here for approximately 1 minute before Teddy Long came out to cause some mischief. He confronted Ricky Morton on the apron and started bad-mouthing him, laying out the challenge for either Morton or Gibson to take on a member of Doom in a singles match. He was very irate about the mere existence of the Rock and Roll Express, and he let the commentators know it. More so than Jim Cornette was ever irate about their existence. And he had the Midnight's feud with the Rock and Roll for years. Doom had 2 or 3 matches with him? But Theodore R. Long, he was determined to rid these guys from the NWA forever. So he made that point and then left ringside. Ricky and Robert took turns working over Kazana and Watson before putting him away with a double dropkick. We did see Kazana attempt a Flair flop bump in this match. I can confidently say he was no Ric Flair. Now, I would have had to presume they were planning to do some kind of R&R versus Doom return match for the titles at the Fall Brawl Clash. I'm thinking they might have had to scrap that after Robert got hurt, though. Or maybe they just blew it off on TV within the next couple weeks. Guess we'll find out. We had Mean Mark squashing Joe Padera in about 90 seconds. They aired a couple pre-tapes on the show with Paul Lee hyping up the Danger Zone for NWA main event. Apparently they were giving him a handful of interview segments for that show. Lined up were guys like Pillman and Sting. I don't know what the Danger Zone segments looked like in 1990, but I do remember what they looked like the year prior. Those cheap-looking green screen promos with fucking Jack Victory standing beside him like a total dweeb. They weren't putting a lot of production value into the segments back then. In 1990, I'm sure they were even more low rent. Moving on, though. Don't really need to say much more about that segment. Paul Orndorff wrestled Paul Lee in what JR billed as Paul Lee's debut match, which I know for a fact is not true, because I remember making the comparison jokes about them having a job guy named Paul Lee, while at the same time they also had Paul Lee Dangerously under contract. JR was all over the place with his format this week. Where did he get the idea that this was Paul Lee's first match in WCW? I also hate it when they do the thing where they put two guys with the same first name in a match together. Makes it impossible to track who's who in my notes. You gotta be super careful with personal pronouns. It does make it funnier when I write things like, Paul threatens to stomp on Paul's junk. Makes you wonder how that's humanly possible. Speaking of impossible, this match was impossibly bad. This Paul Lee, he was absolutely rotten. It may as well have been his first ever match, because he was horrible here. His bumping made trainees in wrestling school look like they had 15 years of experience. To be fair, too, it didn't help that Mr. Wonderful was also extremely talented and always wanted to have his style of match, regardless of how good or bad the opponent was. So, it was a Paul Orndorff match. He was going to hit all his signature spots, and best of luck to Paul Lee to try to feed for him. He eventually went over with a pile driver. Seeing the slow-mo replay of Paul's expression after he took the pile driver, Paul Lee that is, that was another peak moment on this week's taping block. And it appears they are going back to the well with the feud between him and Arn. Only this time I believe it'll actually be for the TV title, which was not the case the last time these two wrestled. Then we had a rather fascinating TV segment. They had JR and Bob Caudle doing a Great American Bash recap to highlight Big Van Vader's debut. They actually went ahead and replayed the whole match with him and Tom Zank, start to finish. It was only a 2-minute match. The fascinating part came with how they pitched to the replay, though. Because in addition to Ross and Caudle putting Vader over, they were also talking about how much of an impact he's going to make in WCW, how nobody's going to be able to stop him. To which I wrote, the only thing that stopped Vader from making an impact in WCW is Japan date commitments over the next calendar year. Which, if you saw the Great American Bash recap, that was the part of the story that was so odd. They debuted Vader at the 1990 Great American Bash, and then over the next 18 to 24 months, he was barely around. He worked like 2 or 3 events between now and the spring of 92. Didn't come on board full-time until then. But like with the way they were talking about him here, they made it seem like he was supposed to stick around for at least a little bit longer after his debut match. But I don't believe that was the case. I'm pretty sure the next time we saw Vader was like Wrestle War next year. Then he left again and came back in October of 91 for that disastrous Chamber of Horrors gimmick match at Halloween Havoc. So I don't know what the plan was. Maybe they figured they could get a few more appearances out of him before he went back to Japan, but couldn't make it work. Who knows? So that took us to Sting versus Barry Horowitz. And the reception for him was great. The Stinger, that is. He was over like wildfire at center stage. Shame it didn't always translate depending on what venue or market they were in front of. Atlanta was pretty much a safe bet for Sting. He had too much of a legacy in that town for fans not to cheer him. And you know, I have to say, again, to the people that criticize Sting's title reign, when I look at this match, no offense to Barry Horowitz, it probably didn't help the Stinger's case that he had to go out there and sell for Horowitz. Essentially working a 50-50 match with him. I know people often used to shit on Flair for being way too competitive with the job guys and giving them too much offense when he was the champion. Duly noted. But at least in Flair's case, he was a heel during the majority of those old studio squashes. When he would go out there and feed for a Nelson Royal or a George South. Sting is out here 2 weeks after he just got the biggest win of his entire career. And I'm watching him go back and forth with Barry fucking Horowitz for 3 minutes. That did not do him any favors. Again, we always talk about the subtleties. The small details do matter. Yes, he still won with the Scorpion. Like, nobody actually thought Sting wasn't winning this match. But there's a time and a place for your top guys to sell or be competitive with underneath talent. This was not the time nor the place. That's all I'm saying. So we did get a solo Ric Flair promo before the main event. Took a minute to talk about how Sting is the man now, but he's going to derail his momentum going forward. He intends on taking back the World Heavyweight title and reclaiming his position as the top guy. I believe that promo might have more so been directed at Jim Herd than Sting personally, but that's just my 2 cents. And boy howdy, how's this for a fuck you Flair match? Everybody barking at Jim Herd, we want Flair, we want Flair. Well, he gave us Flair. He gave us Flair and Wyndham versus the team of Art Mesa and James McKeenan. That was what they came up with for the Nature Boy. Looking back, I think he might have been better off sitting at home collecting a check. We finally get to see Ric Flair work a fucking match on the Superstation. It's in a tag match with 2 ham and eggers. It goes less than 5 minutes. Flair may have gotten 2 minutes of total ring time. Maybe. The best part in this match was when Mesa went to try to stand up to Flair. Flair just paintbrushed the guy, tossed him out of the ring like a sack of wheat. Then he turned around and kept beating up the other job guy. It was the most epic ass beating I've ever seen. It was amazing because not only was Mesa not the legal partner at the time, it was Flair who instigated him getting into the ring in the first place. And when he did, Flair immediately shoved him into the corner, smacked the shit out of him, and dumped him out of the ring. I think I watched that back like 3 times in a row. I laughed harder every time I saw it again. I really, truly don't think Flair gave a shit at this point. He was out there to, well, like I said, collect a paycheck. So eventually Barry decked the other dude with a lariat, and he tagged in Flair so he could win with a figure 4. At that point, I also noted, hey, if you're going to get that rare TV appearance to work a match, make the most of it. We got about 11 more months of him getting jerked around by the office. Rick needs to have some fun while he's still in the picture. And that left us with a Rock and Roll Express follow-up promo on Doom's challenge from earlier. After they beat around the bush for about 2 minutes, calling out Doom and saying they want another shot at the World Tag Belts, we eventually had Teddy show back up to coerce Ricky Morton into wrestling Ron Simmons on NWA Main Event. And I do have to say, I don't think I've seen so much hype and so much passion go into booking a one-on-one match between 2 guys for the secondary syndicated program. One would think Ricky would have to win that match in order for the Rock and Roll Express to get the title shot. I don't believe that was ever established here, though. Ricky accepted the challenge, told Teddy to make sure Ron was ready to go. And I'll tell you, with the way they sold this throughout the show, you would think they were getting ready to promote the main event of Starrcade. All for a title rematch that I don't think ever actually got off the ground. But you know, whatever you want to say about the show this week, at least they weren't trying to rehash old programs with the Georgia Stars from 15 years prior. This at least came across like WCW trying to get over newer breeds of stars. Whether that's Pillman and Zank, Sting, Ron Simmons. The effort was higher. Maybe my standards are just getting lower and lower as the weeks go by. I didn't mind this one, though. When it was over, I thought, hey, you know, I've seen worse. Could the show be better? Absolutely. But considering where we are in the summer of 1990, I looked at this week and said, I don't think the wheels have completely fallen off yet. They will eventually. We haven't gone to the fall yet. But at least for now, there's still some gas in the tank. And I guess you could say the same goes for Midsouth Wrestling right now. I think with Midsouth in the summer of '85, it was a bit different in the sense of they were obviously trying new things. Watts had definitely reverted back to form of trying to run with the bigger guys in the main event picture. Like DiBiase and Duggan were being heavily promoted as the core focal stars again. Even though you still had guys like Dr. Death and Dick Murdoch and The Nightmare. Butch Reed is back in the picture for a little bit. But it's definitely apparent that the old Bill Dundee style of booking was being slowly phased out. There's less week-to-week carnage. The angle-driven material is a lot more sporadic than what we saw throughout most of '84. I mean, they still do a lot of heat angles, but it wasn't as chaotic as it was in, say, like the spring of last year. And while you can definitely argue at some point, the Memphis style of booking was only going to have so much staying power in Watts' territory. I mean, you couldn't do that forever. Elsewise, it would burn the fans out. That being said, there is something to be said about that particular style of booking being a byproduct of generating the most revenue and most success Mid-South ever drew as a territory. It's a formula that worked tremendously well for Jerry Jarrett. Things are a lot different now. The booking style, the talent turnover. It's still Mid-South wrestling, but it's the Mid-South wrestling of, say, 1982 or 1983, as opposed to 1984 and even early 85. And we've covered all those time periods, so we have a good frame of reference. One thing we definitely got more of this week was ring action. Kicking it off with Kamala and Kareem Muhammad taking on Wendell Cooley and Frankie Lane. I still always find it interesting going back and hearing Bill Watts talk about him trying to push Ray Candy as a singles, whatever year that would have been, like 1978, 79, and how he was never able to draw money with him on top. There was the rare exception where he booked him with Ernie Ladd at the Superdome, and they did banner business in that program. But every other time Watts tried to book Candy, he never got him over and he never drew. And I bring it up because I can't exactly put my finger on it. For one, I think when you look back at that time period, well, first of all, the big problem for Watts is trying to push Ray Candy as a babyface. To me, when I look at Ray Candy, he's not somebody that I can easily root for. A guy that size, he's tailor-made to be a heel. But I even look back at some of the stuff he was doing here in 85, or even thinking back to the Memphis run when he was working the tag matches with the actual Zambui Express. I know he was a big guy, and even for a bigger guy, he could still move and do some stuff. But there was just nothing super impactful or stand-out-ish about his ring work. He was a moderately impressive big guy who can move, and that's about it. And I think about guys like the Junkyard Dog. Like, he had the opposite problem where he couldn't work a lick, but he had so much charisma, it never mattered how awful his matches were. He was over because of the personality and his ability to connect with the crowd. That is what Ray Candy was missing. Like, even as a heel, the stuff he did with Akbar and Mid-South, to me, it just never clicked. Even pairing him with Kamala to make that superpower monster heel team, for whatever reason, it did not get over. Or I should more so say, it didn't resonate with the fans. You know, and I'm not exactly sure what they really could have done to fix that. But they ended up going over here after they double sandwiched Cooley. And then Kamala hit a running splash for the pinfall. Interesting how they ended up going with the Bounty Hunters to wrestle Watts and Duggan later on, as opposed to using Kamala and Muhammad. Now, that would have been an interesting visual. So then we had a great segment take place. Originally, it was supposed to be Butch Reed versus Tom Pritchard, but Ted DiBiase came out and got in Reed's face to call attention to something that happened a few weeks ago. And this somewhat helped to explain the weird chaos we got last week when DiBiase and Murdoch got into their fight, which ultimately became a fight involving a lot of other big names, including Hacksaw Reed. And I think this may have been the show we missed, because a few weeks back, DiBiase got a win over Terry Taylor, which in part made DiBiase next in line for a World Heavyweight title shot against Ric Flair. But now DiBiase is catching word going around that it's Reed who's actually the number one contender for Flair's title. And Flair even put a bounty out on Reed's head to where if DiBiase could take him out for good, he would grant DiBiase a title shot. But DiBiase said he'd be willing to do the beating for free because all he wants is a shot at the world title. He doesn't care about Ric Flair's money, which is so ironic when you think about the DiBiase gimmick in the WWF. So we do get Reed and DiBiase in an impromptu match. The best part was when they started exchanging punches before Boyd Pierce got out of the ring. And Boyd very loudly on the house mic just goes, "Hey!" Almost in that exact tone. It was very cartoony. So Reed's out there having his way with DiBiase for a few minutes. It's actually a very one-sided fight for the first, I would say, 4 or 5 minutes. One of my favorite JR quotes came in this match as he was putting over Reed's punches. "The soup bones have found a hole." It's also possible he said the word bowl and not hole. Either way, it's a great line. And then DiBiase turned things around and worked over Reed for a little bit. And at about the midway point here, this is where I started to realize, man, this match is going on for a long time. And the longer it goes, I'm seeing DiBiase and Reed getting more and more fatigued. They're sweating like motherfuckers. I mean, don't get me wrong, they were working hard here. But got a little dicey there in the closing few minutes because, you know, they're doing all these rapid fire back and forth comeback spots. Like DiBiase loads up the glove, but Reed cuts him off and starts mashing his hand in the corner. They're trying to set up all these shoot-off spots and big dramatic sequences. And you could see they were both visibly struggling to pull a lot of this stuff off. Reed in particular, God, he was so gassed. But we get the finish where Reed comes off the ropes and hits DiBiase with a spear tackle. 1, 2, 3, clean in the middle of the ring. And the story coming out of it is that Reed proved beyond a shadow of a doubt he is the true #1 contender for Flair's world title. No excuses. DiBiase was beaten and pinned clean. It's an interesting swerve. I think most fans today would be trained and conditioned to believe the heel would have found a way to fuck the babyface and take away his title shot. So when Reed actually went over here, it got a huge pop. Probably because the fans were legitimately shocked to see it. And again, too, when you think about where this is all leading to later in the fall between Flair and DiBiase, it makes all of this so much more captivating. Seeing how they eventually get to Flair versus DiBiase and all the twists and turns that story takes. And that took us to the Bounty Hunters versus Cowboy Watts and Hacksaw Duggan. And to me, it's still really weird. Not only seeing Watts come out of retirement again in 1985 to work matches against Skandar Akbar in the Army, but you even look at a situation like this, where he's out there working with the Bounty Hunters who literally showed up on TV a week prior and had one match in front of the Midsouth audience. And of course with the Cowboy, he was already very limited with what he could do in the ring to begin with. So they kind of had to be careful with working within those parameters of what he could and couldn't do. I think everybody knew what the match would be. The finish wasn't all that surprising to see Duggan and Watts go over in very convincing fashion. I typically don't like to use the term idiot-proofing a match. I would say they simplified everything as best they could. The match was still beyond hideous, and I'm pretty sure Watts nearly broke one of Novak's legs when he went to body slam the other and threw the guy down directly on the guy's fucking knee. I mean, everybody was winded by the end of this thing. And I gotta be honest too, the so-called pop for Watts and Duggan going over, it really wasn't that much of a pop. People cheered, but it wasn't anywhere near the same level of cheering that Watts and the Dog got in the Superdome when they wrestled the Midnight Express the year prior. And I think that's where this whole story, for lack of better terms, missed the mark. When you think about the whole Bill Watts versus Skandar Akbar feud, Watts coming out of retirement to wrestle again, it just didn't have the same level of heat that the Watts-Cornette feud had in 1984. Mainly because they haven't really bothered to establish any physical tension between Watts and Akbar. Pretty much everything up to this point has been back and forth promos. Like, at least in 84, you had the Midnights attacking Watts, you had Watts slapping Cornette in that epic TV moment. Like, there were physical altercations that justified you wanting to see Watts get his revenge on Cornette for all the bad-mouthing and trash-talking he was doing for months. I just don't think this feud ever reached that point. It never had the same level of steam. And I think that's why when Watts came out of retirement again in 85, it never drew the same as it did in 84. I mean, the fans booed General Akbar, sure, but I don't think it was the same level of visceral hatred like the fans had for Cornette and the Midnights. And again, you have to remember too, this is just a year after Watts had already come out of retirement the first time. And you go back and watch the highlights of that Superdome match, I mean, he wasn't doing much of anything physically in 1984 either. He did a little bit more, but it wasn't a whole lot. So it's a combination of physical inability and the feud not being as hot. It's unfortunate, but I think it's the reality of the situation we're dealing with. I do want to point out, by the way, I said there was a lot of wrestling on this week's show. It was true, but there was also a lot of false advertising going on. Here's another example of that. What was supposed to be Dutch Mantell versus Mike Graham, it wound up turning into a confrontation between General Akbar and Cowboy Watts, which then led to poor Mike Graham eating a fireball to the face. But I don't want to jump ahead too far. Let's break down what happened here. So Akbar comes out and calls out Watts for a fight. It is another week where Dirty Dutch is out there for a scheduled match and ends up being used as a bit player to get over something else. God, no wonder he hated his time down there. It gets more and more understandable as the weeks go by. All those interviews that Dutch conducted where he's talking about him hating his time in Midsouth and thought it was a complete waste of time and energy. Look what the fuck they were doing with him. I would have hated it too. Especially with that fucking travel schedule. So, Watts comes down and gets into a fight with Akbar. They rolled around the ring for a minute and eventually the rest of the cavalry emptied out to try to get the jump on Watts. And of course the payoff here, Akbar goes into the trunks and pulls out the gimmick. And as the heels go to restrain Watts to set his face ablaze, it's Mike Graham who runs over to try to make the save. And poor Mike ends up eating a fireball shot to the face. It was more accurately a brief puff of smoke that came up. Not as dramatic as when they set Duggan's face on fire. But of course, he's sounded like a big deal. All the baby faces go over to attend to him. JR does the classic overselling scream into the headset. And they were trying to milk it like a huge deal. I'm kind of just sitting there watching as a fan, like, Okay? It's Mike Graham. Who cares? And I don't even mean that as an insult to Mike, but let's look past the obvious that he's Eddie Graham's son for a minute. He's had one match on Midsouth TV, which wasn't very good to begin with. And at the same time, it's not like we're talking about someone who was already a super popular babyface in another territory. Mike Graham was barely considered over when he was in Florida. Now, if they did this to, say, a Terry Taylor or a Dick Murdoch, yeah, that'd be one thing. Mike Graham being used as collateral damage here just seemed kind of like a rush job. It's like they wanted people to think that Mike getting his face burned was a big deal when the reality was it kind of wasn't. I think to a lot of people it was like, oh, okay, that's unfortunate. Well, you can't save them all. Again, nothing against the guy. I think I said all there is to be said about Mike the other week. His story is tragic. It's terrible what happened to him, and as well as his close personal family members, including his dad. But at the same time, we don't have to pretend like Mike Graham was ever a super talented second-generational star, because we know the truth. He wasn't. It was another Greg Gagne or Eric Watts type experiment. Or David Flair. Didn't work. And of course, here's what kills me. They come back from break. They just move on like nothing ever happened. It's right back to the ring for more action. Never mind that poor sap getting his face burned in the previous angle. We've got the Nightmare to take on Brickhouse Brown, damn it. Oh, one thing I forgot to mention too in that previous segment. The camera completely missed this in all the chaos. We also had the Nightmare running Dick Murdoch's shoulder first into the ring post. When the announcers mentioned it at first, I was like, what are they talking about? And you literally see Murdoch on camera for a split frame selling before they cut the commercial. And I was like, oh, okay. Well, that was the thing that happened apparently. Would have been nice to maybe see that. Midsouth was great, everybody. I never said they were flawless. They still had their occasional booking and production hiccups. The Nightmare beat Brickhouse with a pile driver in about 2 minutes. Literally had nothing else to say about it. And then we had Al Perez versus Dr. Death Steve Williams. And this was a real test for Dr. Death. Could he be the one to finally get me to care about an Al Perez match? Many have tried. All have failed. It was actually a combination of Williams and DiBiase, because they were both crucial parts to this segment here. And I will give them credit. It was still an Al Perez match. He did absolutely nothing here to impress upon me that he ever should have been considered a world champion at any point. But for 2.5, 3 minutes, this was okay. DiBiase tripped up Perez behind Alfred Neely's back. Williams took over for the heat. Perez did a couple flashy comeback spots before trying to put Steve away with a German suplex pin. Then DiBiase hit the ring for the disqualification as the heels ghetto stomped him into oblivion. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken here, this is all eventually setting up a DiBiase and Williams versus Al Perez Wendell Coley feud You heard that right. Of all people, I have no earthly clue how they winded up roping Wendell Coley into all this, but I believe that's where it's all headed. And the only reason I know that is because I'm pretty sure they end up having Perez and Coley beat DiBiase and Williams for the tag straps, which was just... Well, it was a decision that was made. I won't get too specific with my thoughts yet, but a questionable call when you consider all the other teams they had on the roster at this point. Al Perez and Wendell Coley. That was quite the pair. And then we had the closing match. This was also a great segment. Probably my second favorite behind the DiBiase-Reed match. Now again, sort of a blatant false advertisement here, although not directly. It was scheduled to be Dick Murdoch versus Mike Hawk. And of course they established earlier that Murdoch had hurt his shoulder in that brawl with the Nightmare. Or I should say he tried to save Mike Graham and then the Nightmare attacked him. So Grizzly comes out and tries to imply that they're going to have to find a replacement opponent for Mike Hawk, since Murdoch is in no condition to compete, which brings out Oliver Humperdinck to do a Heat promo. He calls Murdoch yellow and says he's too afraid to wrestle because he knows the Nightmare is a threat to him. I loved how Humperdinck didn't actually know who Grizzly or Boyd were here. He actually referred to them as, quote, whatever your name is. Which may or may have not been a shoot, I really don't know. I would like to think that Humperdinck at least peripherally knew who Grizzly Smith was. A fucking legend of the business. But nothing's gonna stop Dick Murdoch. He has too much pride. So here he comes, bad shoulder and all. He gets in the ring and directly tells Humperdinck, after I get done beating this jabroni's ass, I'm going to stick an apple in your fat mouth, pig. And I believe he actually told Hump to, quote, get his ass out of the ring. Not sure if they caught wind of that in real time, but it definitely was not censored. And so with one arm, Dick quickly disposes of Hawk, drops an elbow over him for the pin, and then he runs off Humperdinck like a scalded dog. And I thought it was an excellent way to close out the show. They also re-aired the Mike Graham angle from earlier, but no sense in dwelling on that. For my money, this show was over the minute Murdoch called Oliver Humperdinck a fat pig. And then he beat a job guy with one arm in under 20 seconds. Nothing should ever follow that. That's a fucking main event in any territory. Great show. Yeah, definitely a step up from that Bizarro World show we got the other week with all those weird segments and video packages. In a way, I was kind of disappointed they didn't re-air the Jerry Reed interview, just for my own amusement. I still have that clip saved, though. But yeah, they're definitely setting the stage for some big things down the road. And it might seem a little jumbled right now, but there is a clear path with how they're going to do that slow burn Ted DiBiase face turn. It'll be great once we see the whole confrontation with him and Flair. And then, of course, there's the other side of the coin. It's what they end up doing with Dick Murdoch. And this is all still like 3 or 4 months out. So there's a long time between now and all that crazy stuff that happens later on in the year. But there you go. Rounding out another Friday podcast, and that'll do it for now. So thanks everybody for checking out the show. We will be back this coming Monday for another exciting episode of Retro Raw. Exciting in air quotes. What am I in store for? Probably a lot of pain, blues, and agony. But we'll cross that bridge when we get there. For now, take care all, and peace out.